Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your day at the World Affairs Conference. On behalf of everyone that worked so hard to make this conference happen, we want to thank all the speakers, moderators, security, and of course, all of you for participating. To end off the day, we have the former Mayor David Miller here to speak with us, who Sarah will now introduce.
Mr. David Miller was the 63rd Mayor of Toronto, serving from 2003 to 2010. During his tenure as the city's top executive, Mr. Miller was a strong advocate for environmental sustainability, balancing the Toronto municipal budget, cleaning up City Hall, and broadening the reach of the TTC, among other things. Today, the World Affairs Conference is fortunate enough to have the former mayor here to close our conference. With his expertise and dedication to some of the world's most pressing issues, we will come closer to bridging the Great Divide. Please welcome Mr. David Miller.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you also for the Blue Army water bottle that you have given me. As a just got to test it here. Okay, it works. There we go. Blue Army. Now, I'm a Lakefield old boy, so many of my high school friends are shocked that I've just supported the Blue Army. There we go. And I understand your conference has been terrific. I certainly want to thank you very much for the invitation. And I want to thank the organizers who've done an excellent job. And I think some of the chairs are in the third row here. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for the gracious introduction. And on behalf of all your peers and colleagues and guests from outside Toronto, thank you for hosting this conference, which I think is really, really important. And I was asked to speak today a little bit about issues of inequality. And the way I've decided to do them is to talk about what I see from my perspective as a 50-something-year-old man who was the mayor of Toronto, and whose life story is I come from a small village in England. I immigrated to Canada in 1967, went to Lakefield, studied in the United States, and have been a lawyer and a politician. And I think it's very clear that there is significantly increasing inequality in society. From my perspective as a former mayor, I also think it's very clear that if we act together, we can make very positive change and create a society in which people have much more opportunity, and there's much more of a chance for everyone, no matter what walk of life you're from. And the way I like to talk about that is using the phrase One Toronto. So what I'm going to speak about today is some examples of what we did at the City of Toronto to try to ensure that our city was a place where everyone was welcome, not just some people. And it's a very important thing in Toronto's case because not only are we a city with economic diversity, not only are we a city with significant cultural diversity, we're also a city that has significant diversity of newcomer status. So as I'm sure you know if you're from Toronto, but maybe you don't if you're a guest from elsewhere, more than half of the people living in Toronto today are first-generation immigrants. And that's not true in any other city around the world. So it provides Toronto with significant opportunities and I think lessons that can be drawn for other cities around the world. And that's important because today in the world, it's the first time since about a year and a half ago that more people live in cities than don't. The world predominantly for thousands of years was rural. Today it's mostly urban. So if we have lessons we can learn in Toronto about how to live together more successfully, those are lessons that will help the world. And so first part of these remarks, I borrowed a couple of slides from a professor at University of Toronto. His name's David Hulchansky. And I think they're important slides. This one talks about whether we have a just society today. And And we don't see too much discussion of that in the newspapers. We see lots of discussion about taxes, If you're in Toronto, lots of discussion about public transit at the moment, and I'll speak to that later, but not too much about justice, social justice. There used to be a lot. And these are some signs that a professor at the University of Sheffield said of a society that has inequality and reinforces it. So things like, exclusion is necessary, despair is inevitable. What he means by that is the idea that, well, there'll always be poor people, so why should we bother doing anything? And whether you agree with all of those or not doesn't really matter. It's what we hear. And I hear echoes of this in the press and on talk radio all the time. What's the point? We can't do anything. It's a global market. We're stuck with what we have. Well, I think that's not true. And I think the most important thing in building a just and equal society is deciding to. That's the most important thing. Once you decide to do that, you can find ways to do it. And you'll see my examples from the city at the moment in a few minutes. But we have to decide that we are going to have a just society. And that means overcoming language like this. And it works. And I know it works because of two reasons. First of all, I've seen it work. Secondly, I've seen the reverse. And this is a chart. It's a little bit busy, but it shows you the income share of the top 1% for the US, the UK, Canada, France, Australia, and Sweden. And if you look over at this chart, in 1980, society starts becoming less equal. It's very interesting and it's dramatic, particularly in the United States. So the richest people start to get more and more a share of the wealth of society, and that starts in 1980. Well, what happened in 1980? Well, I was in university. My rugby club went to the U.S. National Championship. We lost in sudden death overtime. Perhaps if we'd won, that would be different. Maybe this chart isn't about David Miller's rugby career, but what happened in 1980 was there was a series of elections around the world that started with Ronald Reagan being elected in the United States. He was elected in 1980, and Ronald Reagan didn't like government very much. And he said, we'll be better off if we cut taxes, particularly on rich people. Rich people then invest more, they will create wealth, and everyone will be better off. It's a theory of economics called trickle-down economics. Shortly after that, Margaret Thatcher got elected in England. Margaret Thatcher had basically the same idea. She said if we get rid of trade unions, cut taxes, rich people will create wealth, it'll trickle down for the benefit of everybody else, we'll all be better off. Brian Mulroney was elected in Canada. Similar kind of philosophy, except he was more moderate. He's what Canadian tradition of red Tories. But you can see the consequences. From 1980 to today, inequality has increased tremendously in Canada, the UK, and the US. And it's because deliberate decisions were made through governments to bring in place policies that ensured that people who were rich got better off, and not very much attention was paid to policies that shared the wealth once it was created. A different decision could have been made then. A decision could have been made then to say, you know what, we're going to focus on how we share the wealth. And that was not taken, and we see the results. You see different lines in Sweden and France, which had a different political history. Through a lot of that time, France had a socialist government under François Mitterrand. So the point of this chart for me is not to remember exactly where the US and the UK were, but to make the point that political decisions matter very, very much. The decisions we make collectively by electing people matter very much. And in that case, we made decisions that favored inequality. The City of Toronto, while I was mayor, we did something different. We tried to make decisions that favored equality, not inequality. Now, I mentioned David Halchansky a few minutes ago. He's a professor at U of T. You might know him. He's done a study that talks about 3 different cities in Toronto. And one of the cities that he talks about is a city where there are neighborhoods where there's a concentration of low-income people. That's not Toronto's history, by the way. That's more of a phenomenon we associate with the US. But it's become true in Toronto. And what this map shows is those neighborhoods. And while I was mayor, we did some work with Mr. Holchansky, with the United Way, with the province of Ontario, to analyze what neighborhoods had a lot of people living together in poverty and also had low quality of public services. We call those priority neighborhoods because they became a priority for investment. So the decision we took was we would prioritize investment in people who had the least and in neighborhoods that needed it the most. And these are the priority neighborhoods. There's 13 of them. They were neighborhoods who statistically had the highest correlation of low incomes and a lack of investment in public service. And you probably know a lot of them: Jane Finch, Jamestown, Malvern, up on your upper left. Sorry, Jamestown, Rexdale, Malvern on the upper right. All neighborhoods that required investment and needed opportunity. It became our priority to ensure that people in these neighborhoods had a real chance, that the wealth that existed in Toronto, and particularly the public investments, went to those who needed it the most. And that's a contrast to this kind of policy. In fact, it's the exact opposite. And this is a project that exemplified that philosophy. This is a slide of the renewal of Regent Park. Now, Regent Park was not a priority neighborhood for a very simple reason. It had a large concentration of poverty, but it had reasonably good public services like a community center and a library. But we had an opportunity to renew the building in Regent Park. And it was very important to do it because Regent Park had been built at a time when people thought if you isolated a community that was low income and built some green space and other services, you'd have a really successful community. And of course, what happened is the people there were isolated from the mainstream of the city and the economy, and Regent Park became a very difficult place to live. Fantastic community spirit, but people were struggling. And one of the reasons they were struggling was the roads were literally cut off from the rest of Cabbagetown. Another reason they were struggling was Regent Park was rent geared to income housing. So if somebody got a new job and a higher income, they had to move out. So it became a community in a great deal of transition. And one of the things people wanted was when they got a better job and a higher income, they wanted to be able to live in the community. And we needed to build new housing for middle-class incomes to do that. So that, in a nutshell, is the Regent Park Revitalization Program, which helped meet the goals of connecting that neighborhood with the people around it and ensuring that people could stay there and live there, which builds a stronger fabric of the community. And it brought investment, but it did something else. Two other really important things. And it's because at the heart of our thought was this idea of how do we ensure that the investments and the wealth that are being generated in this city benefit everybody, not just some people. Well, the first thing that happened for Regent Park is we brought a grocery store. There wasn't one. Imagine living in a neighborhood where there's nowhere to buy groceries. There wasn't even a bank, because banks often don't locate in low-income neighborhoods. There was nowhere people could bank. There was nowhere people could shop for groceries. And there wasn't even a Tim Hortons. So, and I find that funny too, but it's amazing. When we brought this grocery store and the bank and a Tim Hortons, it became more important to people because those were physical symbols that they were a normal neighborhood like everywhere else. It became more important in some ways than all the investment was going into building these new buildings. We had a Tim Hortons and a Royal Bank, and I give them credit because they both came in, and this grocery store. So that was important. It was important there was investment here, significant construction. So what we did was we approached the developers through the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and said to them, you know, you're working in a neighborhood where a lot of people don't have decent jobs. You're bringing in hundreds and hundreds of very good construction, unionized, highly paid, with benefits jobs. We want you to work with the unions and train local people so they can work on building the houses that they're going to be living in. And so we had a job training program. This is a slide of some carpenters' apprentices. We had a job training program, and 25% of the jobs from this investment had to be people who lived in Regent Park. And that was very important to the people of Regent Park because their houses were literally being demolished. Yes, they were getting a grocery store and the Royal Bank and Tim Hortons, but they were also facing significant upheaval. And they wanted to say, and one of the things when we first approached them to talk to them about this, they wanted to see that their families would benefit directly from this investment. And we were able to ensure that that percentage of jobs went to local people, highly successful, helping local people get the training they needed, not just to work on this project, but to work on other ones elsewhere in the city afterwards. Second thing that's needed if you have neighborhoods like these priority neighborhoods in Toronto where people are struggling is childcare. And it's, to my mind, a fairly straightforward thing. In Toronto's case, and I think this is true around the world, in a neighborhood marked by poverty, people are usually working. It's a myth that they're not. They're usually working, but they're usually working low-wage jobs, often service jobs. And typically, people work 2 or 3 part-time jobs, and everybody in the family works, because that's the only way you can survive. So if you don't have access to early childhood education in which you know your child is safe and getting good quality learning experiences, first of all, you're going to be very worried about your children, but secondly, you can't work. One of you will not be able to work. Very significant to families in low-income neighborhoods. So when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, he had a program called the National Childcare Strategy in which he agreed to invest in the building of new childcare centers. City of Toronto, we anticipated this coming because it was an election commitment he'd made that he was serious about. And so we developed a strategy and we opened 63 new childcare centers, most of which were in the priority neighborhoods, many of which were in Catholic schools, never been done before in the City of Toronto. Unfortunately, Stephen Harper, when he became Prime Minister, canceled this program. If he hadn't done that, we would have built enough childcare centers in the second stage that there would not be a waiting list for childcare in Toronto. Extremely important to ensure that people get to work and children have a really good start in life. And very movingly to me, at one of the openings of one of these centers, the custodian from a Catholic school came over to me and he was crying. He was about, I don't know, he was probably in his late 50s, and he told me his wife had died, and because he worked late, his son went home, and his son was young, went home by himself, and there was nobody there. And he said, now I know my son's going to be safe. And for me, it was very moving, because I know some of these things academically, that you need childcare in order for people to work, but I saw this man saying to me, I need that childcare in order to be sure that my son's safe, in order to keep my job. And there are thousands and thousands of people like him in Toronto, extremely important. And again, this went through the idea of how do we ensure that the wealth we have in our city is shared to support everybody and give everybody a real opportunity. This photo's just here because I thought it was really cute. Like, they're just so great. They're all engaged and happy and smiley. So another area that we focused on with the same philosophy is environmental issues. And we have environmental challenges in this city and in this planet, and one of the ways we're going to overcome those challenges is through acting in cities. When we thought about environmental issues though, we didn't just think about greenhouse gases or local air quality, although they were very important. We also tried to use those environmental initiatives to create jobs, opportunity, and hope. And this slide tells you a number of the things we were doing. I won't go through them because there's a couple of important ones that connect to me the idea between deciding that you're going to provide opportunity, that you're going to bring Main Street and Bay Street together, and actually acting. This slide of Canada's only urban wind turbine at Exhibition Place. It's like the slide of the children. It's another photograph I really, really like, so I always like to show it. But it's also interesting to me because this arch, part of the Princess Gate, is one of the oldest pieces of architecture, most historically important in the city of Toronto. And behind it we have one of the most modern things, which is our wind turbine. And it's symbolic when you come into Toronto that this city has strong environmental values. And we do. We're a leader internationally in reducing greenhouse gases. We've significantly cleaned up our local air quality emissions. We have great parks that we're investing in. But we're also using those projects to fight inequality and bring hope and opportunity to people. And one of the ways we're doing that is through a program called Tower Renewal. And I'll just have to give you a little bit of background about this for a minute before I get to the point about inequality. There are 4 numbers that are really important. They're 2, 50, 75, and 80. The 2 is the amount of the world's land mass that's urban. 50 is the amount of the world's population that is urban, that lives in cities. 75 is the amount of the world's energy that is consumed by cities. And 80 is the percentage of greenhouse gases that come from cities. So almost all the greenhouse gases in the world come from cities. So if you're trying to fight climate change, you have to act in cities. And that's true in Toronto, that's true around the world. Well, where do the greenhouse gases come from? They come from the energy used to generate electricity. They come from the energy used to heat and cool buildings. And they come from the energy used in transportation. So if you address your environmental issues from generating energy, from heating and cooling buildings, and from transportation, you can significantly reduce your greenhouse gases. And if you do it right, you can also create jobs and opportunity. Well, that's what this program is about. These buildings are called concrete slab apartment buildings. If you look on this one, you can see stripes. Those are the concrete slabs. They were built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. The Canadian government had a deliberate program. They were subsidized, whether private or public, because there was a belief we needed housing. And the housing was going to be provided by high-rises. As it happens, my mom and I, when we emigrated to Canada, lived in a building very much like this one, not quite as big, but very, very similar. And there's 2 qualities to concrete slab apartment buildings that set them apart. Very important qualities. The first one is they're permanent. Concrete is really strong. These buildings are going to be here for at least 100 years. Beyond your lifetimes, beyond your children's lifetimes, beyond our grandchildren's lifetimes. They will be here for a very, very long time. The other quality isn't as good. Concrete has no insulating power. So these buildings are terrible wasters of energy. And they were built mostly at a time when energy was really cheap. So people didn't worry about it too much. Well, now energy is expensive, and we know that it's when it's generated from fossil fuels, it's risking the environmental health of the planet. So we have to find ways to reduce our energy consumption. And there's so much energy used in one of these buildings that a 1-bedroom apartment, like one of these ones on the end, uses more energy to heat and cool than a bungalow. It's counterintuitive. You know, you'd think that an apartment building would be more efficient. It isn't. So some very, very bright engineers at the University of Toronto looked at this from an environmental perspective. And they discovered that if you put insulation on the outside, you can reduce the amount of energy used to heat and cool these buildings by a huge amount. There's 1,000 buildings in Toronto. If you insulated all of them on the outside, you would reduce the energy used in Toronto by about 5 or 6%. And that's the Kyoto target for the reduction of greenhouse gases. Very, very important project. So they brought it to us at the city and said, we'd like you to help support this environmental initiative to reduce energy use. We loved that idea. It's called Tower Renewal. It's still being done by the city. But we said, well, let's take a look at where these buildings are. What else can we do while we're trying to do this environmental initiative? This map shows where these buildings are. And if you remember the map of priority neighborhoods, many of these clusters of buildings, these pink clusters, are in those priority neighborhoods. And so what we said to the U of T engineers was, we said, great, we'll come on board, but we also want to work with the unions. Same slide, but it's the same point. We want to work with the unions to try to create local jobs in those neighborhoods where people need it the most. Now, as I said, there's 1,000 of these buildings in Toronto. The estimate is it takes 30 people a year to do the insulation on the buildings. That's 30,000 jobs. And our philosophy was to train people who lived in neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, to get those jobs. That was a choice we made because our choice was to try to give opportunity to everybody, not just to some. And it works. And the great thing about this program is concrete buildings like this exist in every city around the world. So our engineers and architects went to China to show Chinese engineers and architects what we're doing in Toronto. They actually sent a delegation of 200 engineers and architects from China to listen to engineers and architects from U of T explain about this program. That's the significance of it. And we were able to take the environmental idea and turn it into an idea that created and spread equality. As you can see, here's the priority neighborhoods, very, very similar location of these buildings. Not exactly the same, but most of the priority neighborhoods have significant clusters of those buildings. One final initiative I want to speak about that's been in the news a fair bit lately, and I think reinforces what you can do as a people, a city, and a government once you decide to make equality at the heart of your decision making, and that program's Transit City. As you know, there's going to be a debate on that in City Hall tomorrow, so it'll be very interesting, well, to me at least, and hopefully to the people of Toronto. So Transit City is thought about as a transportation strategy, which it is. It's a very important one, but it's also a strategy about social development and combating injustice and inequality. And I'll explain why, but I got to give you a little bit of background. In 2006, I ran on a platform that essentially said to the people of Toronto, we've gone 30 years without building significant public transit. We need to build a network. If you don't have a network, people aren't going to choose public transit over their cars. And today we have basically two lines, the Yonge University line and the Bloor Street line of rapid transit. We need a network of rapid transit. I asked the TTC to develop one based on the best knowledge there is about transportation needs. And this is the strategy they developed, which is primarily light rail. It's light rail for a very simple reason. Most of Toronto is built like a suburb. It's not built like a dense city like New York City. And so the transportation needs are met by light rail. Plus, when you build light rail above ground, it's very inexpensive. It's about a quarter to a sixth of a subway. So we could get an entire network for the price of one subway line. And because Toronto hadn't built rapid transit in 35 years, it was very important to do that. The Premier announced the funding for this on June 15th, 2007. And I must give you some advice. June 15th is my wedding anniversary. And Jill and I agreed while I was the mayor, because I wasn't home very much, that I would always take my wedding anniversary off and spend it with her. And we usually went to Stratford. So I phoned Jill on about June 12th. We got a call from the Premier saying the Premier's going to announce full funding for Transit City. And we said, great, what can we do? And they said, please show up and say nice things. And I said, great, when is it? June 15th. So I had to phone Jill and say, Jill, I do want to spend our wedding anniversary together, but we're going to have to spend it in a bus garage in Mississauga. My advice for those of you, if you do ever get married, do not have that conversation with your spouse. But it did cause me to remember the Premier's announcement. I will not forget the date. So he announced the funding June 15th, 2007. We started the environmental studies and the engineering. Ground was broken on Shepherd East in December 2009. Finch was ready to go in 2010, but the province asked us not to go ahead, and we bought the tunnel boring machines for the center of Eglinton, which has to be underground. The road is too narrow, in 2007, and I believe they're completed now. And Transit City is the subject of a fair bit of debate right now because there are some people who say, well, we should build a subway even if it means not having a network. I personally think that's wrong. I think it's much smarter to use the available money to create a network, but it also misses the point. The routes that were chosen for Transit City were chosen because they're the busiest bus routes in this city. Well, who tends to take the bus in Toronto today in 2012? Well, it's lower income people. Higher income people will take the subway and other rapid transit, but bus routes tend to be lower income people. And if you go back and look at the priority neighborhoods, Jamestown, Rexdale, and Jane Finch are exactly where the Etobicoke Finch West LRT goes through. Steeles, Lamoureux, and Malvern are exactly where the Shepherd East LRT goes through, and Scarborough, Malvern, and so forth. These lines were actually being built where the lowest income people in this city needed decent transportation. And this matters very much because if you bring rapid transit to somebody who doesn't have it and either can't afford to drive or doesn't drive, it can transform their lives. So I met a woman on Shepherd. I took the bus on Shepherd to see what it was like for people. And she told me that she lived a little bit north of Shepherd. She took a bus down to Shepherd East and the Shepherd bus across to the end of the Shepherd subway on her way to the airport. So she took two buses, then a subway, then another subway line, then another bus along Finch, and then another bus to the airport, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 buses and 2 subway lines to get to work in the morning. But that was only a part-time job. And that took her 2 hours every morning, and that's if the buses connected properly and she didn't miss one. In the afternoon, she went from the airport down to the Royal York Hotel, where she was a cleaner, and then went back home, 2 more subway lines and 2 buses. And she commuted somewhere between 4 and 5 hours a day, just in order to feed her family. Now imagine if she had rapid transit and could take the Shepherd East LRT and the Etobicoke Finch West LRT and so forth. It would take literally hours out of her day. Well, what could she do? Well, first of all, maybe she could upgrade her skills. It would give her time to take a college course, for example. Humber College is quite near to where she worked. She could take courses there and upgrade her skills. Maybe she could be home early enough that she could pick up her children after school and they wouldn't have to be in childcare, which is expensive. Lots of options for that woman to dramatically change her life and her way of being a part of the city of Toronto. And that's really what was most important about Transit City. Yes, it met the transportation needs of Toronto and meets the transportation needs of Toronto for the next 35 years. It's also very significant environmentally, but its biggest importance is as an instrument of social justice. And that's really the one message I wanted to bring today to this conference, which I know has been discussing some really interesting and difficult issues. But I know from my experience that what matters is the decision. Are we going to make a decision to support the people and invest in the people who need it the most? Or are we going to make a decision like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did that results in significant inequality? And I'm quite optimistic because I know that not only are cities the place that cause most of the greenhouse gas emissions, they're also the place where most of the jobs are, most of the invention, and most of the creativity. So if we can harness that creativity through the idea that we should be doing it to support those who need it the most, I think we can succeed. And that's certainly a Canadian value. That's what a lot of our institutions, like our medical system, are about, ensuring that everyone's welcome. I think that's what Toronto's about, and that's why I wanted to be here today to bring that message. I really appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. How long do we have?
So we'd like to open up the floor to questions now. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so if you'd like to ask any questions, just go up to the mic there in the middle of the aisle, and thanks very much to Mr. Miller.
Just a reminder, guys, no supplementary questions. Just ask one question so there's time for everyone else to ask their questions as well. Thank you.
And if you wouldn't mind telling me your name as well so I can answer you appropriately.
I'm Jack Van Ostrand, and my question is, what's your opinion of our current mayor and the work he's doing?
Well, that's a fair question, Jack. I've also been taught that when you're out of elected office, you really shouldn't comment on your successor, that if you wanted the right to speak, should have run for office. Suffice to say, there's not much he's done that I agree with. Thank you. And I think Jack's got a career as a reporter asking blunt questions like that, so.
Hi, I'm Colin Tweel, and I just have a question for you. How much faster are streetcars or light rail or whatever like that is, and versus buses?
That's a really good question. The reason I keep using the word light rail is they're actually not streetcars. If you Google Basel or Zagreb or Warsaw, you'll see what they are. They're more like trains than streetcars. They're quite beautiful vehicles. And it depends is the answer. But when they are operating in their own right-of-way, as Transit City will be compared to buses that operate in mixed traffic in cars, the first thing is they come on time. And that's dramatically important. On Finch, for example, you will today get 4 buses that are supposed to come every 5 minutes, one after another, and then not one for 20 minutes, which is a huge problem if you have to make connections. The second thing is, I think the operating speed ends up being something like 32 kilometers an hour, including all the stops. And buses are much slower than that because they get stuck in traffic. So if traffic's bad, the buses don't go anywhere. And the real advantage to this, there's 2 advantages. The first one is they're not in mixed traffic, so they're faster and reliable. The second one is when you have rail-based transit, the private sector sees that as permanent, so they'll start investing in developments along the lines. They don't do that with bus routes because they can be changed at any time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Connor Healy. You talked a bit about inequality, among the United States, Canada, and you certainly see that in the United States and the Occupy movements and whatnot that protested. But how inherent do you think inequality is on Bay Street as opposed to the inequality on Wall Street?
So can you talk about that a bit more? I'm not precisely sure what you meant by that.
I'm asking you what the difference is between inequality in Canada and inequality in the United States.
Oh, between Bay Street and Wall Street?
Yes.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
That's quite all right.
It's a really interesting question because Canadians are very much like Americans. We're a nation of immigrants. We, in our diversity, we look like Americans, but there are some fundamental differences. And one of them is in Canada, we still believe in solving problems collectively. So in the U.S., the sort of anti-government movement is almost mainstream now. It's not just the Tea Party. I mean, people call President Obama a socialist in the U.S. I'd call him a progressive conservative. That's what he really is. And I think you see that, people do very well on Bay Street, but it is nothing like what happens in the U.S. I mean, Mr. Romney pays 15% income tax because of the job he has to basically invest in other companies. That's a concept that's foreign to Canada. Everybody above a certain income pays the same rate of tax. So I think our inequality is much less than the U.S., and that's because of traditions. Our Constitution starts with the idea of peace, order, and good government. It doesn't start with individual liberty. And I think that reflects the Canadian experience. So I'd say, Wall Street's incredibly dynamic. I'm in New York all the time. It's very exciting. But the levels of income disparity are much, much higher there than here, in my view. And I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Leah Bibla. And what kinds of environmental initiatives do you suggest Toronto take to further reduce our greenhouse gases? And how do we rank compared to other cities in the world?
Toronto's doing a very good job because we're trying everything. I think the key, though, so we've done a little bit of everything. I think there's two things that are really critical if you're serious about the environment. The first is those sectors that I said, the way you generate electricity, heating and cooling, buildings, and transportation. You've got to get those three sectors right, and the key to that is the electricity grid. Not to get too technical, but our electricity now, we build big power plants, ship it a long way, and power a city. What we should be doing is creating all sorts of small green power plants within the city, like wind turbines and solar and ground source heat pumps and deep lake water cooling. And then allowing people to, in effect, sell electricity to each other through the system. That's called a smart grid. And if you have a smart grid with green energy, you can make a huge, huge difference. And they should be doing that in every city around the world. There's lots of potential. The only country that's got it right so far is Germany, and look how successful their economy is. So you do the right thing for the environment, you do the right thing for the economy. Germany's the leading example. That's one big piece. The other piece is you've got to engage people. So on that busy slide with all the things the city's doing about the environment, one of the programs is called Live Green Toronto. Go on the city's website and look at it. We hire people to go in neighborhoods and work with people and help them organize themselves, because people want to do the right thing, they don't always know how. There's some small grants available, things like that, to really help people. And people have done things like have urban farms, create solar panel installations that supply a whole neighborhood with electricity, all those kinds of things through that program. So you got to get the big picture right on the one hand, and on the other hand, work with people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Matthew Turk. I was wondering if Toronto could afford the transit city idea at what it has now.
That's a fair question, Matt, whether we can afford rapid transit. I mean, certainly having light rail transit above ground is much more affordable than building subways, particularly when the subways aren't needed because there's no transportation demand for them. And the light rail, as it was going to be built, did not lower the road capacity at all. In fact, in some places, it enhanced it. So if our choice is only one of those two, yes, we can afford it. Can we afford it in the big picture? I'd say we can't afford not to do it. And here's why. From business perspective, as it gets to be more difficult to travel around Toronto by road, the delays to shipping things are a very real cost. And manufacturing is still important in and around Toronto. And if we can't ship things quickly, it means we're going to lose a lot of those jobs. And those are good, decent, often unionized jobs with good wages and benefits. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development a few years ago estimated we lose $6 billion a year in productivity because people can't get around Toronto. Well, the only way to improve that is through transit and getting cars off the roads. So I would say light rail is more economical, and we don't really have a choice. We have to do it, so we have to find a way to pay for it.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
I'm Mr. Miller. My name is Nishan Payalan, and my question is regarding your opinion on using income taxes by means to help income inequality, because while there are many positives to that, I feel like people forget that it can act as an economic incentive, and I feel that increasing income taxes in, say, the top 1 or 2% can actually erode from that incentive and make. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, taxes are the price of civilization. We all like to grumble and you don't want to pay taxes, and I always want to make sure my neighbor, if he's making the same amount of money as I am, is paying the same taxes, and if he finds a loophole that I don't, I get really upset about it. Yeah. But I don't buy. I studied economics in undergrad, and I don't buy the argument that if you increase taxes on better off people, they have less incentive. I just don't think it's true. If lower income people, they work incredibly hard for a very small amount of money. And if successful upper income people, getting well paid is important to them, but their job satisfaction is about other things. It's about succeeding. It's about doing a good job. It's about being proud about what you do. It's about being on Bay Street. After a certain point, I think people who do well from society have an obligation to give back. And I don't think you need punitive levels of taxation. You know, in England at one point in time it was 90% at the highest tax level. That's obviously very high, but within reasonable bounds. I don't believe it's a disincentive. That's certainly not true amongst my peers who are doing very well. You know, they take pride in their job, and that's what really motivates them to succeed from that perspective. They obviously want to do well economically, but I think if they made a slight bit less, it wouldn't make much of a difference from that perspective.
All right, thank you. That was perfect.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for the questions and for your time and attention. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We'd like to thank Mr. David Miller for his time and his speech today. We sincerely do appreciate his expertise and his perspective. So as a sign of our gratitude, we'd like to offer him a little gift on behalf of the college, on behalf of the World Affairs Conference, and all the delegates here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So now we have very little time left in the conference, but now is just sort of the time for us to say thank you to everyone who's helped us bring the conference and make it what it's been this year. So we'd like to thank the conference chairs, the program chairs, the plenary heads, WAC operations, registration, the delegates, Ms. Gauthier for organizing the moderators, Mr. Crawford and the booth guys, and lastly, Mr. McVeigh and Mr. Baker from Branksome for being great faculty advisors. And now we'd just like to quickly call up the UCC conference chairs, Kaleem and Omar.
Hey guys. There's one more person I think we really need to thank. I mean, without all of her support this year, this conference really wouldn't have happened. I mean, I'm sure I drove her crazy. I'm sure Max and Sashwa drove her crazy, but she put up with us. She kept us organized. She's the reason this conference has happened. So let's all, hope you can all join me in a large round of applause for our conference faculty supervisor, Ms. Rima Wada Parsons.
All right, guys, we are nearing the end of the conference. Yeah. All right, so we are nearing the end of the conference, and I'd just like to thank all of you for coming here today. We hope it was a wonderful experience. You know, I was talking to one of the speakers earlier, and I asked him why he came to the World Affairs Conference. And what he said to me is that the reason he came here, yeah, sure, he was going to share his knowledge, but what he really loved about the conference was it was giving an opportunity to inspire the people, the young people of today. And we hope to some extent that we did do that. Yes, there was controversy. Yes, there was debate, whether it was in prostitution, in the unions, in a morning panel. There was definitely some debate, an exciting level of intensity. But what we hope you saw throughout all of that, as Mr. Mark Garneau put it last night, is a sense of unity that we do care. And so in the end, as you leave these halls today, we hope you were inspired by our speakers, and by the discussions with your friends to really bridge the great divide that exists between the topics and everything around us. So with that said, I would like to officially close the World Affairs Conference 2012, and thank you for coming here.